December 1944, the Ardennes forest. A week after the German offensive began on December the 16th, Lieutenant Davis had stopped measuring war in miles and started measuring it in minutes. Every minute his men stayed still in that white maze was another minute a patrol could hear them breathe. He pushed what was left of Easy Company through iced spruce, found a shallow fold of ground where abandoned German foxholes broke the snow like black teeth, and ordered a 10-minute halt to scavenge anything usable. Men spread out with the careful speed of the hungry, prying frozen ammunition from pouches, tugging at straps, shaking magazines to make sure springs still moved. The result was a few extra clips, a canteen, a coil of wire, minor advantages in a winter that punished the unprepared. The cost was the noise they could not fully control, metal clinking, boots crunching, whispered curses, each sound a small flare in the silent forest. While the men worked, Davis studied the abandoned foxholes as if they were a map written in dirt and ice. He found ration tins stamped with German lettering, a length of wire cut cleanly as if someone had left in a hurry, and a shattered periscope half buried in snow. He ran a gloved hand along the lip of a firing slit and felt the smoothness where another soldier's elbows had rubbed it raw. The result was an unwanted intimacy with whoever had held this ground before, a reminder that the forest kept replacing one set of desperate hands with another. The cost was the creeping certainty that, if he lingered too long, his own men would become the next abandoned trace in the snow. Davis kept his own work narrow and practical because practicality was what held a unit together when the map stopped matching the terrain. He walked the line, touched shoulders, watched fingers for stiffness and eyes for panic, and repeated the rule that had carried them through the first days of retreat. Anyone in field grey was the enemy, and enemies were not people to imagine. The result was obedience that looked like discipline, men using hatred as a substitute for warmth. The cost was numbness, an emotional frost that made killing easier, but also stole the part of a man that noticed the difference between a target and a life. A shout cut through the wind. Davis strode over, expecting a cache or a trap, and found Corporal Parker kneeling beside a body half buried in drifted snow. The uniform was stiff with frost, the face turned toward the sky as if the dead soldier had tried to watch the clouds for warmth. Parker had pulled the coat open, searching for maps, cigarettes, anything that could be traded for comfort or survival. The result was a paper envelope, creased and damp, wedged under the inner pocket. The cost arrived in Parker's expression. He had meant to loot, and instead he had found something that felt like trespass. Davis took the envelope because officers took responsibility for what their men touched. He meant to toss it into the snow and keep walking. When he flipped it once, though, his eyes caught two details that did not belong in a trench. A date, December 20th, 1944, and a place name written in neat, careful script, Berlin. The result was a pause small enough to hide. The cost was that the pause created space, and space was where thoughts slipped in. Captured papers were supposed to go straight into a case for intelligence. Davis told himself he would do that once the scouts returned, once he could think clearly. Instead, he slid the envelope into his own field jacket, against the hard edge of a compass and the softer beat of his pulse. The result was a quiet deviation from procedure. The cost was a trail he was creating without meaning to, a fact that could be questioned later by men who would not care about motives. A scout team had been out since before dawn, trying to find a safe line for the next movement. They were late. The men's hands slowed, cold clawing through gloves, and the halt stretched past 10 minutes because the forest did not respect schedules. The result was time Davis did not want. The cost was that with no immediate order to execute, his mind drifted back to the paper against his ribs, as if the letter itself were pressing for attention. He could feel two duties collide: keep his men alive and treat captured intelligence as something larger than his own thoughts. The result was hesitation taking a new shape. Not on a trigger, but on whether to hand the envelope up immediately or keep it close. The cost was the realization that even small deviations could unravel authority when men were already frightened and hungry, because soldiers forgave fear more easily than they forgave uncertainty in their officer. He needed a translation, and that meant another person inside the circle of secrecy he had accidentally drawn. He found Sergeant Harper, a platoon leader whose mother's family had spoken German at home, and told him to pull only the core meaning. Harper unfolded the letter with slow care, as if the paper might tear from cold, and began to murmur English in a low voice. The result was that the dead man gained a voice. The cost was that the voice did not sound like propaganda. It spoke of radiators ticking at night in an apartment, of a mother's hands smelling of soap and onions, of a sister who cried when he left home. It spoke of warmth as if warmth were a country he could not return to. The result was an image Davis had not asked for. Domestic detail in a place built for killing. The cost was that his own home rose beside it, uninvited, making the distance between us and them feel less useful. Harper hesitated on a line about snow. The writer asked, without drama, when this endless snow would end, because the snow made everything the same, and he could not tell whether he was walking towards safety or toward death. The result was a question Davis heard every day without anyone speaking it. The cost was the sharp shame of recognition, the feeling of being caught thinking what he had ordered himself not to think. There were hints of the front, marching at night because aircraft hunted roads by daylight, hunger that turned bread into wood, a sergeant who threatened men who fell behind. But the letter kept returning to the same small truth. He wanted to go home, and he doubted anyone in Berlin understood what this winter was doing to him. Near the end he wrote that if he died, he feared he would be remembered only by snow, and he asked, quietly, whether his mother would forgive him for leaving her alone. The result was that the enemy became a son in Davis's head, not because Davis wanted that, but because the letter forced it. The cost was that Davis felt his own rules loosening at the edges, as if a single piece of paper could pry open a seam in the armor he wore to lead. Harper looked up when he finished, waiting for instruction like a man handing over a weapon, and unsure whether it was loaded. Davis told him to keep his voice down and to say nothing to the others. The result was compliance. The cost was Harper's brief hesitation, a flicker that suggested silence could also be a lie. Davis took the paper back and folded it along its old creases, an act that made it feel like equipment, even as it refused to become one. The scouts returned at last, breath steaming, faces grey with fatigue, and reported Germans moving in small groups through the timber, probing, cutting around, hunting for breaks in the American line. The result was a tactical picture that matched the distant gunfire they'd heard all morning. The cost was urgency that made Davis's stretched halt feel like a luxury he could no longer afford. He got the platoons up and moving, trying to lock the letter into the back of his mind the way he locked away faces. The battalion radio crackled as they marched, more static than voice, but the message underneath had a spine. A side road fork near an old logging cabin had to be held long enough for friendly units to pass south. Davis acknowledged with a short transmission and did not ask questions. The result was a mission that narrowed the world to a single point on a road. The cost was the sense of being moved like a piece, pushed toward a square someone else would never stand on. He chose a dull route to the fork, staying in the tree line and using shallow draws to mask movement, because being dull kept men alive. He kept spacing wide enough that one burst could not erase them but tight enough to control. The result was an orderly march. The cost was that cold punished every step and punished patience with it, and each minute spent moving was another minute the men could not rest their feet without losing feeling. By the time the fork appeared, it felt less like reaching a destination and more like being caught. Two roads diverged around a small rise. A half-collapsed cabin sat near the junction, roof bowed under snow, walls scarred by old axe marks. Davis chose it because it offered cover and because there was no better choice. The result was immediate work, men digging firing positions into frozen ground, breaking boards to brace, stacking snow into crude parapets, and scraping shallow shooting lanes through brush they could barely see in the white glare. The cost was that everything took longer than it should have, because every movement fought numb hands and stiff joints, and time was the one resource they could not resupply. Davis walked the positions and gave short, controlled instructions. He added one change he could not hide from himself. Hold fire unless you have a clear target. Confirm uniforms. Confirm weapons. The result was a defensive line that might reduce wasted shots and friendly panic. The cost was that it sounded wrong to veterans who lived by first shots. Sergeant Blake, his senior enlisted man, followed him with a look that carried an unspoken question. Blake waited until they were in the cabin's shadow, away from the others, and spoke in a flat voice meant not to carry. "Sir, if we wait to be sure, they'll be sure first." The result was a challenge that was not insubordination, but close enough to sting. The cost was that Davis did not have an answer he could share without sounding unsteady. He said only that he wanted discipline, not panic, and that discipline meant choosing shots, not spraying the woods. Blake nodded once, because Blake understood tactics, and because Blake understood that arguing further would split the line. The cost was that the nod did not feel like agreement. It felt like a note kept for later. Davis checked the radio again, trying to pull certainty out of static, and told himself the letter was irrelevant, a dead man's private words with no place in a road fork. The result was a lie that steadied his hands. The cost was that the lie did not settle in his chest, and the forest felt as if it were waiting to see which version of him would speak first. If you want to hear what happens when that silence breaks, and what it does to Davis and his men, please tap like and follow for the rest of the story. The first sign of the enemy was not a voice or a shot. It was the way the forest went quiet in a different way, as if even the wind had paused to listen. Davis raised his hand, and the men froze with the obedience that came from months of survival. The result was still bodies behind snow berms, rifles pointed into gaps between trees. The cost was the strain of holding that stillness, the slow burn in forearms, the tremor in fingers that could turn caution into accident. Footsteps drifted through the timber to the north, irregular, cautious, not the heavy stamp of a full unit, but the careful approach of a small party moving by feel. Davis shifted to the cabin window and lifted his binoculars, because at this range the difference between friend and enemy could be a single shade of cloth. The result was movement resolving into shapes. Several figures, low and hunched, rifles held close, helmets catching dull grey. The cost was that seeing them clearly made them real, not symbols, and real people were harder to reduce to a simple command. They reached the open space near the fork and hesitated. One pointed down the left road. Another shook his head and gestured toward the right. A third lifted something like a folded map and then shoved it away, embarrassed to be caught needing guidance. The result was a tactical gift. They were walking into the kill zone unaware. The cost was the timer running under Davis's ribs. Any extra second gave them time to notice the cabin's unnatural angles or the berms that did not belong. Blake crouched beside him, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. Parker lay in a firing slot to the right, breath coming too fast, so tense his knuckles were pale even through gloves. Sanchez pressed his handset to his ear, trying to catch warning through static. Harper held his rifle steady at the end of the line, gaze flicking between Davis and the figures in grey. The result was a line ready to obey. The cost was that their obedience depended on a decision only Davis could make, and every man would pay for it. Davis adjusted the binoculars and found the youngest face almost by accident, because youth announced itself even under frost. The boy held his rifle in a way that suggested he had been taught the motions but not the reasons. He blew into his hands and rubbed them against the stock, not daring to drop the weapon, even to warm himself properly. His cheeks were raw with cold. His eyes were not hard. They were tired, scanning the trees the way a trapped animal searched for an opening. The result was an overlap in Davis's mind. Berlin on an envelope, a mother's hands smelling of onions, and a boy in grey standing in the wrong place. The cost was time slipping away, while his mind argued with itself. Davis felt his own breathing become loud in his ears. He was aware of his finger resting outside the trigger guard and of the line behind him waiting for the smallest change in his hand. The result was that he could, if he chose, turn the fork into a killing ground in 1 second and remove the threat. The cost was that he could not keep the threat faceless. If he gave the order now, he would be ordering the death of a boy whose private voice sounded like any private voice. Blake's eyes cut to Davis's face, and the message in them was not subtle. Now. Davis did not nod. He did not shake his head. He raised his hand again, flat, palm down, and pressed it slowly toward the snow, the signal for hold and stay low. The result was silence. The cost was immediate. He had just spent his men's trust to buy a chance that might not exist. The Germans took a few more steps. One turned his head slightly and stared toward the cabin, not because he had seen it, but because instincts did not need proof. Davis could see the boy's eyelashes rimed with ice, could see his mouth tighten as he listened. The result was certainty that this gamble lived on the edge of a glance. The cost was that the gamble depended on his men remaining perfectly still, and men were not built for perfect stillness, especially not men trained to believe hesitation was how you died. A tiny metal click came from the line, small enough to be a sling buckle or a gloved hand touching steel. In that silence it sounded like a bell. The result was Davis's mind snapping back to procedure. The cost was that procedure arrived too late. Parker's rifle discharged. The shot cracked across the fork like a whip. The result was instant chaos. The Germans dropped into snow, scrambling behind the rise, firing back toward the cabin and berms without knowing exactly where the muzzle flashes were. The cost was the worst version of both outcomes, bloodshed and exposure without the clean advantage the ambush had offered. Davis's first response was physical. He shoved Parker down into the firing slot and kept him there because shame would not stop bullets. The result was that Parker's head disappeared below the berm before the first wild return rounds tore through the cabin's boards. The cost was that splinters sprayed into the snow and a round punched through a plank close enough to make Davis taste dust. He forced himself into procedure because procedure kept panic from taking over. He barked a short fire command, just enough to give permission and direction, and the men answered with controlled bursts. The result was disciplined pressure instead of a blind spray. The cost was the collapse of the moral illusion he had tried to build, replaced by the only language the enemy and the forest recognized. Blake moved without waiting for further instruction. He crawled along the cabin's broken wall, shifted his angle, and fired into the Germans from the side. The result was immediate effect. One German rose to run and folded into the snow. Another stopped moving when Blake's angle found him. The cost was Blake's exposure, his life risked to repair a hesitation he did not understand. The fight lasted less than a minute. The Germans were not here to die for a fork in a forest. They broke contact fast, voices sharp and frightened as they retreated into timber. The result was 2 bodies in white and a sudden hollow quiet. The cost was that quiet did not mean safety. It meant the enemy would report what they had found. Sanchez's radio caught a fragment from battalion, probing patrols, heavier forces possible after any contact. Davis did not need the radio to understand what it meant. The result was a decision that followed gunfire as surely as night followed day. They could not stay. The cost was abandoning a position they had barely built and moving again under pressure, tired legs asked to perform miracles. Blake looked at Davis then, not with anger and not with triumph, but with a bleak appraisal, as if he were measuring the lieutenant's future usefulness. The result was a judgment Davis could not challenge without making it worse. The cost was that authority shifted from something assumed to something tested, and Davis felt it like a crack in bone. They left the fork hunched and spread out, moving through trees that offered cover and threatened betrayal with every crack of frozen branch. Davis assigned rear security and forced himself to watch Parker, because Parker was both problem and symptom. The result was that Parker kept his rifle under control and followed signals without argument. The cost was that his eyes stayed too wide, the look of a man beginning a lifetime of remembering. They made a new hide in a stand of thick spruce where the branches formed a low canopy that held snow up like a roof. Davis ordered no fire, no loud talk, no unnecessary movement. The result was a pocket of relative invisibility. The cost was stillness again, and stillness now tasted like the moment before chaos, making every man's muscles tighten at nothing. Davis reasserted control the way officers did when they could not offer comfort, by working. He checked ammunition, counted heads, looked for injuries. The result was a strange relief. No one dead, no one badly hurt, only cuts from splinters and bruises from cover. The cost was the realization that the absence of casualties did not erase how close they had come, and that close was tied to his hesitation. He knew the report he would eventually write. Enemy patrol engaged at a road fork, driven off, friendly elements continuing movement. The result would be a clean record that fit on a page. The cost was that the record could not contain the truth that mattered, because the truth was not tactical. It was personal, and personal truth was treated like weakness in a unit that needed certainty. He could feel the men watching him without looking at him. Veterans listened for a tone that meant panic. Newer men listened for a tone that meant permission to be afraid. The result was that Davis kept his voice flat and his face still, because expression could start a collapse. The cost was that he felt himself becoming a mask, the same kind of mask he had tried to force onto the enemy. When the immediate tasks were done, Davis let his hands find the items that remained unresolved. He pulled the captured letter from his jacket and held it without unfolding it, because unfolding it would have made it speak again. The result was restraint. The cost was that restraint felt like cowardice, as if refusing to read were another refusal to face what he had almost chosen. He reached into his other pocket and found what one of the retreating Germans had dropped, a small leather identification booklet. The result was an official fact, heavier than the letter because it could not be argued with. The cost arrived the moment he saw the birth year, 1927, 17. Hamburg was printed beneath it. The result was an unwanted picture of a family waiting for a letter that would never arrive. The cost was the obscene symmetry of imagining his own home beside theirs, the same winter pressing against windows, the same fear of a knock at the door. Procedure said he could file both items with captured documents. The result would be compliance, and a trail that could, if anyone cared, lead back to him. The cost would be questions he could not answer in the language of the army. Why did you have this? When did you read it? Did it affect your judgment? In war, morality could be treated like a flaw. He also understood the objects had become fuel inside his own line. If men had a thing to point to, they would point to it. If they could not point to a thing, they would point to a man's face and make up the rest. The result was a choice that was no longer only about conscience. The cost was that every option now carried danger. Sanchez had scraped a small depression in the snow and built a tiny, careful fire under a makeshift windbreak of branches. It was not a comfort fire. It was a utility fire, just hot enough to warm a cup and keep hands from going numb. Davis crawled to it and let his posture look ordinary. The result was heat without comfort. The cost was smoke risk, but they needed their hands, and every choice had a risk. Davis fed the letter into the flame without reading it. The edge curled and the handwriting vanished in a rush of orange. The result was the destruction of a voice that had never reached its destination. The cost was the sting of betrayal, because remembering had been the letter's only request. He pushed the identification booklet into the flame next. Leather resisted, then softened, then shrank, the printed numbers blistering away. The result was that 17 and Hamburg dissolved into ash. The cost was knowing he had erased evidence, not truth. A gust of wind pushed through the branches and carried a few specks of ash up and away into the dark hollows between needles. The result was scattering. The cost was that Davis could not predict where memory would settle, only that it would settle somewhere inside him. Boots crunched softly nearby. Blake. Davis did not look up, because looking up would have invited a conversation he could not afford. The result was a moment of parallel silence, two men sharing heat and withholding words. The cost was the certainty that Blake had seen enough to keep counting, even if he never spoke. Blake did not ask what had been burned. He only nodded once, a gesture Davis could not interpret. Davis gave the next movement orders in a crisp tone that sounded like armor. The result was that his men tightened straps and checked magazines and prepared to move. The cost was the avoidance in their faces, doubt expressed without mutiny, and Davis felt it as clearly as he felt the cold. As Easy Company slipped deeper into the Ardennes, the wind covered their tracks almost as soon as their boots made them. The result was a world that looked clean. The cost was that clean surfaces hid everything. The two bodies at the fork, the ash in the branches, and the fact that, for a few seconds, a trained officer had chosen not to begin killing when he could have. Snow kept falling. It fell on the road behind them, on the path ahead, on decisions waiting in the timber. The result was continuation, because war did not pause for conscience. The cost was that Davis would carry a new kind of weight, lighter than paper, heavier than any pack, into every next contact where the first shot would never feel purely automatic again.